Members of the LGBT community are 50 times more likely to be affected by HIV than heterosexual people, according to Sarah Wood, a pediatrician focused on lowering youth HIV rates. This is likely a result of the lack of inclusivity in adolescents' sex education. Sex education should be required to include members of the LGBT community in every state. There are 0 states in the United States that require LGBT relations to be included in sex education. And this is part of why STD and suicide rates are incredibly high for LGBT teenagers. Today, I will discuss how inclusivity in sex education could lower LGBT's STD rates, improve their mental health, and overall improve their physical and mental well-being. First, I will discuss the incredibly high STD rate in LGBT members because of lack of knowledge. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the nation's health protection agency, sexual minority groups are at a higher risk for HIV, STDs, and unintended pregnancy. Pediatrician Sarah Wood agreed with this and added that gay men actually make up 68% of total new HIV infections, and LGBT youth are half as likely to use condoms compared to their heterosexual youth. She also explained that while the rates of gonorrhea, syphilis, and chlamydia have decreased for adolescents, they have actually increased for LGBT youth. They lack the education on sex, and many think that since there's no risk for pregnancy in a same-sex relationship, that it's unnecessary to use protection. 41% of these LGBT youth actually know little to nothing about condoms, and 75% know absolutely nothing about other types of contraceptives. Advocates for Youth, a nonprofit organization that fights for sexual rights, agreed that inclusive sex education could be an incredibly powerful tool to reduce the health disparities and stigma against LGBT youth. Making sex education more inclusive would definitely lower these STD rates in LGBT youth by educating them on the dangers of unprotected sex. Next, I will discuss how the lack of inclusivity in schools is damaging to LGBT teens' mental health. The CDC explained that over 63% of LGBT students have felt hopeless, and 48% have seriously considered suicide. They are 4 times more likely to commit suicide than heterosexual youth. The fact that many schools refuse to discuss any sexuality besides heterosexuality plays a big role in this. States like Alabama are even allowed to teach that being LGBT is unnatural and that they are wrong for being that way. This in itself is damaging, but it also promotes bullying, and many students face a lot of prejudice at school. Transgender and gender nonconforming youth experience a lot of harassment, discrimination, and even assault. This leads to a lot of LGBT teenagers facing anxiety and depression. It can also lead to something called the minority stress effect, where these teenagers use drugs and alcohol to cope with the stress they face from being stigmatized by teachers and classmates. Many LGBT students whose school curriculum contained a positive and educational discussion about the LGBT community faced less discrimination in school, and they felt overall safer and more open about their sexuality. It is apparent that having inclusive sexual education programs all across America would positively affect LGBT's youth's mental health and make them feel much safer in school. When I was in high school, we had a very short, maybe 10-minute discussion about sex. We only discussed heterosexual sex, and there was no mention of the LGBT community. Many people in my town are incredibly uneducated about the LGBT community, and they often make very homophobic and transphobic remarks. Many of my friends waited until they graduated and moved away from our town before they decided to come out because they were genuinely scared for their own well-being. If an inclusive sex education program had been required, I feel like it would have definitely made them feel more comfortable to be themselves. This is an issue all over the United States, and although sex education would not eliminate the stigma against the LGBT community, it would definitely benefit their physical health by teaching them about how to have safe sex, and their mental health by teaching them that they are not wrong to be themselves and love who they want. Now that you know why it is important that an inclusive form of sex education should be required in all United States. First, it would decrease the STD rates considering 41% of LGBT teens do not even know how to use a condom, according to the CDC. Second, it would benefit many of these teenagers' mental health issues by creating a more open environment for them, and they would feel much more comfortable in being themselves around their classmates. Refusing to be inclusive to the LGBT community puts a big portion of America's youth at risk. It is the 21st century, and it is time to be open about discussing sexuality without people feeling embarrassed. Inclusive sexual education can provide so much more insight on how the LGBT community works, and it will open gates for acceptance. Times have changed, and the LGBT community deserves as much love as the heterosexual community.